Topic 5, political structures and institutions. This is going to be video 2. And we're going to get into the different types of government structures, starting with the executive branch. Okay, so political institutions, this is the structures of the political system. Of course, this is going to be very much a review of things that we have learned already in comparative and in AP US. So common structures that exist in most countries we study are going to have a legislator, an executive, a judicial system, a bureaucracy, and armies. But one thing that is important to distinguish is just because you see that there are similar political structures, it does not mean that in each country the political structures operate the same way. There's not the same checks and balances. There's not the same separation of powers. The judicial branches aren't going to interpret law the same way. Okay, so for example, legislative branches in countries are going to vary in importance. In the United States, we know the how a bill becomes law process. We know our bicameral Congress. We know the leadership and the roles of the different leaders, the organization along party lines, and that the U.S. Congress is going to play an active role in creating public policy. All right, in the UK, the House of Commons, public policy really centers around the cabinet, the Prime Minister's cabinet. This house is a deliberative body, and it is going to play a role in formulating legislation. In the National People's Congress, in China, it is a rubber stamp to whatever the General Secretary / President wants. So the leaders meet and they listen, and they don't do much else. There's not a lot of input for the National People's Congress. So we can look at each of the legislative branches that we study, but realize that each one of them may play a different role. All right, let's talk about the difference between separation of powers and fusion of powers. Okay, so separation of powers. The first discussion question asks you to contrast separation of power to fusion of powers. Okay, so separation of powers you are familiar with is where each branch of power is divided, or each branch government has specific powers that are given to that branch. They have the ability to check each other. So you are familiar with like the legislative branch. Their power is to write laws. And then the executive branch enforces those laws. The judicial branch interprets those laws. And you know that each one of these has checks over the others. Like the executive can veto the laws. The judicial branch has judicial review, be able to declare laws unconstitutional. Well, when you have a fusion of powers, there's going to be a system where the authority is concentrated in one body. So you see that in China, where the authority of the government is concentrated in the president, and who is the general secretary of the Communist Party. All right. Also, you can see more of a fusion of powers in parliamentary systems, where the head of government is part of the parliament. Okay, we're going to go over the role number 2. It asks you to describe the role of the executive. So the role of the executive, they are the enforcer. In most countries, on paper, they're the ones that carry out the laws and the policies. Okay. Generally, they're going to act as the head of state, where they are going to represent the people. They're the symbol of the country. Some countries, the executive has policymaking power. Like in the United States, they can the president can issue executive orders. He can use the bully pulpit. In some countries, the executive or the head of state may just be a figurehead and may be there just to consult. Okay, the executive, if they play a head of government role, they're actually in charge of running the government. So in this country, our president is both head of state and head of government. They do both. But in the UK, the head of state is the Queen, the head of government is the Prime Minister, and those are separate separate positions. But again, the chief executive, they're there to enforce the laws, and the chief executive is in charge of maintaining a cabinet or other bureaucratic agencies to help them carry out those laws. All right, the chart that follows is going to have the different qualities of a parliamentary system. So this slide is going to focus on the information of the information you need to fill out the different qualities of parliamentary systems. So for voting, in a parliamentary system, remember you are voting for your MPs or your members of parliament, and then your members of parliament are going to pick for you the prime minister. And the prime minister is going to be a member of the majority party. Okay. Head of state and head of government are going to be separate positions. So the head of state would be a queen, or the queen, and the head of government is going to deal with the day-to-day running of the government. That's going to be a prime minister. Okay, it could be called a premier, or like in Germany, a chancellor. You're going to have a fusion of powers. So the distribution of power is really not going to be distributed, because the power is going to be shared between executive and legislative branches, because the executive is a member of the legislative branch. The cabinet members are going to be a part of the legislative branch as well. The cabinet members are going to be leaders in the majority party to help the prime minister, the same party, carry out the day-to-day operations of government. So all of the cabinet members currently in 2018 in the UK are Conservatives, part of Theresa May's party. Okay. Because the executive is part of the legislative branch, the chief executive really can't veto the laws of the legislative branch. I mean, if you're the majority party and you're part of the majority party who's making the laws, you're not going to veto your own party's laws. And then elections, something that we'll learn is that sometimes in parliamentary systems, you may not have regular set elections. So there was, and this is an important, just kind of as an aside, the UK no longer has irregular intervals between elections. The Fixed Term Parliament Act was passed on the 15th of September in 2011. And that act means that general elections will be held on the first Thursday every 5 years, or first Thursday in May every 5 years. There are ways that you could trigger a snap election, and we'll get into that when we cover the UK. But one of those would be the votes of no confidence, which I briefly mentioned in class not too long ago. But that's when the sitting government would fail to get support for a bill, and the sitting government is forced to resign, and new elections have to be held. And that gives the people the opportunity to kind of check the powers of the parliament. All right, so we're going to fill out the presidential system side of the chart now. All right, so voting. Citizens vote for legislative reps and executive leaders separately, so separate parts of the ballot. So we're going to have that in Mexico, Nigeria, Mexico and Nigeria and Iran, and the UK, of course. And the US. President is both head of state and head of the government. There is a separation of power, so the legislative write law, executive enforces those laws. There's a system of checks and balances. The president gets to pick the cabinet members, and the cabinet members are a part of the executive branch as opposed to the legislative branch. The president can veto. That's generally one of their checks as part of the separation of powers. And they're fixed terms. So, like in the U.S., president can serve for 2 4-year terms. Now, of course, semi-presidential systems, the president and the prime minister coexist, and you see that in China and Russia. In Iran, just the dual executive, of course, is the president and then the supreme leader. Okay, there are advantages and disadvantages, and that's the next chart. In a parliamentary system, the advantages is that there's not a lot of gridlock because there is a fusion of power. You pass legislation, and there's no question about who is responsible for the legislation. So it's not like Congress or the parliament can blame the president because there is no president to blame. You can't really blame the prime minister. The prime minister is a part of the parliament. Disadvantages, and it really rests on hasty decision making. If you don't have somebody checking anybody, there's not like a check on the legislative branch, or there's no way to slow the legislative branch down on a decision that they're making. It could cause instability in the legislation, or legislation that creates instability in the government. All right. Advantages of the president. In a presidential system, you're going to have checks. So you're going to make sure that the legislative branch can't make hasty decisions. In a presidential system, not in the U.S. The president, of course, is not directly elected in the U.S. But if the president is in a situation where they are directly elected, and especially if there's a runoff election where the president is going to hold a majority, then the president can rule with a mandate. A disadvantage is that you're stuck with an unpopular president until the next election because you have those fixed terms. Of course, there could be gridlock because the legislative branch can pass a piece of legislation. The president can veto it. And when you have a president, you are running the risk of a person that might try to concentrate power in their hands, like Putin. Semi-presidential system, an advantage. The president can blame stuff on the prime minister. You can remove an unpopular prime minister, but you still have stability in the government because the president is going to serve a fixed term. And that just enhances checks and balances if you have a prime minister with a lot of power and then a president with a lot of power. Just as shielding a president from criticism could be an advantage, there could be confusion amongst the population about who to hold accountable for bad legislation. Okay, we're going to quickly go over the types of legislators or legislative branches. Okay, we know that this is the branch that makes laws. Okay, bicameral, is a 2-house legislative branch. An advantage is that, especially you can see this in the House and the Senate, if there is divided government between those two, there can be a balance of power. So the Senate can't do anything that the House might not want passed or that the House thinks the people wouldn't want, vice versa. And especially in the U.S. system, the House can have power, or the House has powers that the Senate doesn't. But just as that can be a good thing, it can cause gridlock. If you have one house, like you have in China or Iran, you're not going to deal with gridlock, but you also don't have a check on the power of the legislative branch like you do here in the U.S. Okay, that is it for the different political structures as far as the president and legislative branch.